So it's New Year's Eve in Manila, and I thought I would focus this video on the distinctions between what might be considered strengths or gifts and what might be considered limitations, and also talk a little bit about the frustration about the fact that they don't all add up to being inherently disabled or abled. They add up to being extremely skilled, knowledgeable, etc., useful in some very limited channels, maybe 5 to 10 times more than average, and being extremely limited in other channels, 5 to 10 times more than average. And it doesn't add up to a neat story of sick or super healthy or loser or winner. It's complicated, and in a rushed society, almost nobody wants to hear the nuances, but I think they are the most interesting and important things to discuss. So looking at disabilities, the first thing that I talked about was the compulsive need to focus intensely on something a percentage of the time. Now, when I look at the spectrum and hear some of the stories out here, I'll see that, for example, certain people with Asperger's syndrome will obsess about the whole ecosystem of ants. And they don't seem to have a whole lot of strategic flexibility with that focus. It's an ongoing, fairly steady focus. But I believe it's meeting the same need that I meet when I compulsively need to focus on something. However, because I've partnered with that pretty consciously and welcomed and embraced it as a somewhat neutral trait, although the underlying anxiety is very stressful on my body, I get to pick what that focus is. And so as a result of that, we get two somewhat paradoxical fallouts. One is super achievement, goal focus, and when I focus that on thinking, like when I'm writing a chapter, I give myself pretty high marks for being lucid and data-driven, meaning the obsession with carrying a train of thought to its eventual conclusion leads me out of the norms of accepted thinking. Here's what I mean. Someone tells me I'm being really selfish, and I've actually heard that I'm really selfish or self-centered. And I'll look at that, and I'll follow it along. And the first thing I'll do is I'll analyze the data. So I'll say, okay, you are saying that I'm self-centered because you have concluded, without checking with me, that this behavior, and this behavior is for this reason that you have projected, and you've projected a reason that's supposedly all about me, and without checking with me, you have concluded that I'm self-centered. That's a pretty self-centered process, i.e., you've looked at selective data, you've projected your story on it, you haven't checked it up with me, and you've then concluded that you're right, and based on that conclusion, you've told me something about me. That's a self-centered process, meaning it is literally self-referencing in its entirety until you've then presumed that, I should hear this and that that's the way it is. And you've often done that kind of as a dismissal, i.e. it's not an opening to a dialogue, which makes it that much more self-centered. The entire ritual is self-referencing. But I'll take it a step further. I will then say, that's actually not very selfish, i.e. to alienate people in your life by making up stories about them, not checking them out, not dialoguing, and dismissing based on false evidence and projections is not being kind to yourself, i.e. there was a completely different set of reasons that I was doing those things. That one of my bigger frustrations is that people don't check out, they project and assume that I'm doing things for the same reason they would do them, when in fact, as a neural atypical person, the exact opposite may be true. For example, I may be worried that I'll overwhelm someone because I'm neural atypical and I'm in a focused state, and I don't think they can tolerate the intensity of my focus, so I'll pivot and give that focus to something else as a courtesy to my accurate observation of where they're probably at, without making them uncomfortable by revealing just how differently we're thinking. So let's say I pivot around that and I don't check in with them, because that would be the other thing. I could be less self-referencing, not use the statistical data, because I know that out of 100 times when I have that particular conversation, 85% of the time that's correct, and people were uneasy with the reality of our differences being so present and so candidly discussed in a way that's unfamiliar to them. So let's say I do include them, and that's not the case, or it is the case, and then they don't conclude I'm selfish. But if I'm actually being more selfless and relying on the 85% of the time that type of person is not going to enjoy that conversation, and I just pivot away, there's a very high likelihood that whatever story they make up about why I pivoted away from them is not accurate. A woman may say he wasn't interested in my appearance, when the reality is I could care less about women's appearances. As someone who is strongly affected by communication style and presence, and very little affected by bodies, the fact that my eyes might register that someone is sexually attractive is not really high on my radar of importance. The fact that someone is present, sincere, and honest, or is angry and looking for someone to attack, registers really high, because that's going to affect me. But these are just some of the many areas where being different, I get to see how much of the social discourse is based on projection and heuristics and reality. And it turns out it's about 10%. So about 10% of people, or 10% of the interactions, are actually really relating to the people, and about 90% are stories and interpretations relating with themselves, i.e. a person has a story, they then have a feeling about their story, They then have thoughts about their feeling of their story, all self-referenced is, and then they take action based on their thought of their feeling of their story. And that's what most interaction is. And I get to see that because as someone who doesn't fit into the story, I get to see just how much of interaction is illusion and how much is really intimate. Now, one of the consequences of that, so here again we've got this split going on. I'm profoundly frustrated and lonely, in part because I cannot escape the awareness of how much of interaction isn't real. That even when it's, quote, right, it's right on a statistical level, i.e. by chance. It's not right because two people are engaging as human beings. It's just that the stories, like, for example, women having a story that men are all doing everything based on appearance, because that is right, because that is an accurate story a certain percentage of the time, if they hold that story all the time, then a certain percentage of the time they're going to be right. But they're still not, even when they're right, they're not interacting with the actual person. They're interacting with their story that is accurate a percentage of the time with a percentage of people. And so as me zeroing in on this train of thought, I can then take back to the selfishness, thread that I'm exploring, because I've got this feedback that I'm really selfish or self-centered. I can then say it's actually not selfish, i.e., people's well-being, their own well-being is going down as a result of relying too heavily on a self-referencing system with no interruption to exchange real data. This is not kind. Enormous amounts of opportunity, unique moments between people are being missed because people are relating to their story, not the actual data. Now, I can then say, if that person was truly more selfish, what does selfish mean? Selfish means you act in a way that improves self-interest. What does that mean? That means you act in a way that increases the probability and the actuality of well-being, your well-being. But how do you have well-being? As an empathic species, we have well-being when we pick up the contagious states of those around us. So one can even say, I'm pretty sure this is backed up by the data. Sonia Lyubomirsky, in her various research on happiness, she got, finally, someone's funding a little bit of helpful psychology here, but she got positive psychology, funding to actually study happiness rather than the DSM-6 of taking every behavior of every painful emotion, and infinitely expanding the labels, which are then turned into supposed diagnosis, i.e. if someone's angry, they're then diagnosed as angry. But she's gotten this, she's done this, statistics on what creates happiness, and found that once people are secure and comfortable, more money is only going to add about 10% of their happiness. Good relationships, by contrast, 40%. Great daily habits and good relationships, 40%. After survival is met and comfort, when you're not, a few months away from being on the street and fearing that, after that, good relationships is boost the happiness. Why? Because even if you're a billionaire and you've, got the biggest TV and it doesn't feel that great. It's actually not very human. It's a bit sociopathic to move around in the world observing a good percentage of people in pain and distress and not doing anything about it. It doesn't feel good. So the ultimate selfishness, i.e., what helps people experience well-being, is being safe and secure in a group of safe, sane, kind, secure people who care and who are feeling good. That's what creates well-being. So true selfishness extends, it has integrity. At some point it becomes, in the loop, as many dualities do if you really follow them, it becomes selfless. You cannot be 100% truly selfless and not start caring about the environment. And so not only then can I kind of make sense of how and why I'm being called a label and see the amount of social projection rather than real interaction and dialogue and observation, but I can then conclude that the self-centeredness, i.e. that referencing oneself too much, is not selfish, i.e. it's reducing this person's capacity for really seeing and thus well-being and engaging. And then when we do things and behave in a way that depress and, terrorize or don't support those people around us to be at our best, and we end up walking around in a group of unhappy people, it's actually selfless in the sense that we're not taking care of ourselves. So if people would be more selfish, i.e. do the things that truly enhance their own well-being following the data, they would end up naturally at some point in that process of true selfishness being intelligently and kindly selfless, and the circle meets. And so this is a strength, except when it interacts with our culture's attention span. And so here's the juxtaposition, because let's say that I decide to have a conversation with you and I'm in the state where basically there's a pain bubble that's moving through and I'm trying to cope with it by becoming compulsive and having a focus other than the pain to allow me to cope, to tolerate. That's what addiction or compulsion is. And so when I'm dealing with an object, I might burn out my body, but I will achieve meticulous success. And so this is a little bit of like the hacker culture, the Silicon Valley culture, where they obsess on data and this and that and programming, and so they may burn out their body, they may not, depends on their constitution. I've had anxiety for 41 years and such, and I don't know the role genetics plays in this. I know that's a variable, but I've always had a sensitive body, and it's not clear how much of that sensitivity comes from the trauma, the fact that if you're terrorized at a young age and induced into a feeling that you got to do something, but you can't, and that's induced in a really young age, even pre-verbal. Does that induce, through all the anxiety and the adrenal effect, does that create a sensitive body, or genetically, are there more sensitive bodies that make it unusually traumatic when that abuse is done because it's processed at a louder volume? And that's a good way of looking at sensitivity, by the way, is if you think of a sensitive person not as being kind or moral, but as being a microphone that picks up and amplifies every sound in the room, it will beautifully amplify a dissonant cello in a symphony, and it will beautifully amplify the most perfect Beethoven's Ninth. So a totally sensitive person often functions as a mirror, as a reflective thing, because the stimulation overwhelms their consciousness, floods them, they tune out in a certain level, and they just become a mirror for whatever's coming towards them, which is one reason why some of the most sociopathically behaving people are actually, on a technical level, the most sensitive, because they're just amplifying the worst of the society's numbness, denial, lies, tune out. That is very much part of our society, and they're just mirroring it back. They're also feeding back what it's like to be them, which is when you're very sensitive and you are in a completely sociopathic environment. Like I'm very sensitive, so I've got horns, I've got fireworks, I've got kids running down the corridor, I've got hotel doors slamming, I've got cars, and I have PTSD. And so, all of this is painful. So I have my Bose quiet, speakers and, earphones and things like that to reduce the sensitivity, because that being the environment that is there, and none of it is personal, meaning no one's doing this to upset me. But it's also true that no one is aware of me. No one is tuning this down because of me. And if I go out and start talking with lots of people, a lot of people don't care. A lot of people say, buzz off. I don't want to deal with that. Just, this is life, deal with it. I.e., you're stuck in a sensitive body where everything is registering at 3 times the volume that everyone else experiences it at, and that's painful, and we don't care. We're not going to tune it down. You're just stuck here. We don't care. And what someone who's hurting another human being is kind of expressing that state, which is, I don't care that you're hurting, just like you don't care that I'm hurting, and there's kind of a relationship there, like you guys do this to me, I do this to you, we're in a dialogue, there's a mirroring going on, and it's probably not conscious if someone is, acting out violently or whatever, but on one level what they're doing is they're raising the pain level to 3 points past what's comfortable for everyone else, and saying, this is my life, this is my world, deal with it, and tell me about it, that it's not fun and all that. I've known that, for X number of years. And so this is the element around sensitivity. But coming back to this gift and this pulling apart of the pluses and minuses of this state of PTSD, this state of being highly sensitive, this state of having chronic fatigue, etc. One of the strengths is really being able to think outside the box, to actually think, which is not that common, to have people spending hours actually thinking and following things to their natural end, and then correlating that and cross-referencing it with the data and seeing where that leads them. The big negative, however, one of the biggest, is when I'm in what I would call a compulsive corridor, where I'm following a thread, and if I step outside of that corridor, I'm flooded with a pain that I can't handle. So I've got to stay in the corridor. My intensity comfort zone is roughly 5 times higher than average, which means that if you're with me on that journey, my keen observation skills are going to notice maybe a third into the journey, maybe a fourth into the journey, that you're about done. Like, you're ready to just kind of, let's just dissipate this intensity out and just let this all be over. And I can't do it without experiencing dissociation, because I'm not done yet, disorientation, fear, kind of brought out into this big spectrum that I'm avoiding with staying in this corridor. And so I have this really uncomfortable choice to make, which is, am I gracious and do what's comfortable for you, but go through trauma in order to accommodate you? Or do I compromise, basically say, I know what you don't know the hell I'm going to go through, but I do. And I do know the hell you're going to go through at maximum, because I'm watching your face. I'm watching to what extent have you glazed over, to what extent have you gotten a little fidgety, and am I going to compromise? In other words, start seeing the cues and then winding down, or am I going to preempt that at the beginning by basically saying, I do need a corridor right now. If I launch into this is going to be about a 20-minute intense dialogue. Do you care about the question you just asked me for it to be a 20-minute intense corridor? And will you show up and really listen for that 20 minutes? Well, that in and of itself is awkward for the majority of people. They weren't expecting that. They don't know. They don't want to commit. They want an out. And in most cases, they're just making small talk. That's not good enough, though, for me to go through a dissociative cycle so that they can make small talk. So I have this kind of battle with people to see who are the real people who are really showing up focused on an objective. I love that. Who is present and has the time and also has the tracking skills, the ability to actually have this be an amazing ride. Because statistically, there's about 20% of you watching who, when I was following that thread of selfish, the judgment of selfishness to the observation of self-referencing and self-centeredness, to the observation of not being selfish enough, i.e. not taking care of one's well-being, and then following that all the way around to the most selfish is to be selfless and enjoy the synergy and the complexity in between. There's about 20% that probably got some like ahas and saw the texture and the patterns and the landscape of that process. And I am one of those 20%. And a good number of people are, wait a minute, or kind of, that's interesting, but could we get on with it, etc., etc. And yet I do not have the flexibility to not take a thought like that to its logical end. I need to know. And some of that comes from the insanity that I was exposed to growing up, and actually not wanting to enter this insane place or have that be triggered again. So I'm looking for the entire geometric link to actually understand it for myself, so that I have a solid foundation to rest on mentally, independent of what other people make up and do and think, and all their lacks of integrity and all their mixed messages, that I actually know the terrain. And so that's great. Two, there's that compulsive thing. Three, even when there isn't a compulsive thing, it's very disruptive. It's like a musical journey for me to fully explore that circle. And it's somewhat holographic, and it's very disruptive when that is just broken into, or abruptly, I've got to go, I've got to call. I really hate that. And it's disorienting. And so for all these reasons, I've got to do that. And the line between, gift or curse has a lot to do with the type of culture that I'm in and the setting I'm in. Like, I get really high marks if I teach landscape design at the College of Marin, because I'm supposed to track and do all of these things. I get really high marks for my books. Like, oh, this is really clear and all that. And I write the book in that terrain. But I get really poor marks at a cocktail party where I do the same thing, only that's not at all what people expected and apparently want. And they're upset about, why did they get a lecture or whatever at a cocktail party. And I do not have the freedom to not talk that way and have any kind of well-being and sanity. But I do have the freedom not to go to cocktail parties, which I don't. And so if I position myself just right, I can be a super success quite easily. And if that was my goal, I wouldn't even be talking and making this recording, because I have a lot of that message coming back at me, and I can just appear and show up in the slices of time and location where me being me is incredibly appropriate and suitable, and that just